what is the key factor that makes Orthodoxy unique against all other Christian sects, compared to, say, Catholicism, as it were?
I would say what makes it unique is the total picture, from the conception of God to how we know God to human nature, anthropology, to metaphysics, to what's real, what isn't real, to the doctrine of salvation and who the person of Christ is, what his purpose in coming was, to a different notion of what the descent into Hades was, to a different conception of the significance of the resurrection, and then a different eschatology. So essentially the totality of Orthodox theology is distinct from both Protestant and Roman Catholic conceptions in pretty much every, I mean, I don't want to overstress that to the extreme to act like there's not some similarity, because certainly for the first 1,000 years of the church, you had a more or less unified East and West. But it's not just the doctrine of the papacy or the doctrine of something like a change in how we view iconography or images that led to the split. It's a whole host of things. And something like the filioque or papal infallibility is really just an outworking of more fundamental differences about the theology of God himself. So that's what makes it distinct. And then that leads to a different conception of social order. It leads to a different conception of how we view things in the world in terms of their own natures, the ontology of things. For example, a lot of Protestant sects, if they happen to be iconoclastic in that they want to destroy images, not have any pictures of the saints or Christ or anything like that, that tends to a kind of Gnostic view where you're almost led into Puritanism, where the Puritans are debating about whether you can have even a cross, something preposterous like that. So what that does is that leaves a vacuum for secular iconography to replace it with a bunch of degeneracy. So there's a great documentary that somebody did. It's on YouTube. I think it's had like 80 or 90,000 views. Really, really good. It's called I've got it linked to my website. I forget the exact title of it, but it's basically Orthodox theology and the icon. And it's a 3-hour documentary, but it's excellent because it's probably the best introduction to Orthodoxy I could think of to somebody new, because it doesn't start from a deep theological argumentation, which a lot of people will be unfamiliar with. It actually starts with something more familiar, which is the image and how we view images, and how images are a central aspect to Orthodox theology, because God created a world that is to be seen. And even though God's not seen, in Orthodox theology, we don't see that as a contradiction. We see it as a mystery that he has revealed and hidden at the same time. And so this is kind of one of the points I was arguing to Robert Taylor, is that language is both something that reveals and hides things at the same time. So we are all about avoiding dialectics. We're all about harmony and symphonia. And when it comes to church and state, these kinds of issues, we believe in the goodness of nations, of ethnos. We believe in valid patriotism, not blind patriotism, obviously, but defending one's kin and one's people. And so really, to me, I think that's the most coherent worldview as a whole, because it's not just my whims and wishes. There's a broader game plan of which I am called to be a part. You are called to be a part. We are all called to be a part of. And it's not just a fideistic, subjective, evangelical thing where it's like, oh, it's just me and God. No, it's a whole history and a future. It's a past, present, and a future. And it's a story. Every time you go to the liturgy, it's a retelling of a story, and you're part of that story. So that to me is very distinct from especially Protestantism. Roman Catholicism, for whatever good points it has, and I spent a good point of my life and part of my life in Roman Catholicism, I really feel like it's kind of collapsed and is lacking all the stuff that Orthodoxy has. So that's the quick, simple response to that.
Yes, and that's something I've noticed as well, is that we've kind of seen sort of a failure of the Catholic Church and a lot of Protestant denominations as well, right, to encapsulate the West. We've lost the romantic part of Christianity. They've lost touch with everything, and they've lost touch with it seems a lot of way with their scripture and with their old hierarchies as well. And what do you think it is about? Because I don't know if anyone else knows. I'd love to see research or an article about it, but I'm seeing an influx and an increase, an intrigue in the Eastern Orthodoxy Church in the West, both in places in Canada, where I'm located, and in the U.S.
Yes, and this is because people are rootless, deracinated, and they are seeking something to be rooted in. And since we all have a Christian history in the West, we're kind of naturally drawn in that direction. So people are looking into these things, I think, because everybody wants to have a way to find identity. Some people seek it obviously in something like race, or seek it in something like pop culture, whatever. And I'm not saying that those things are completely false. Obviously, there is a reality to races. Certainly, pop culture can be fun, but all those things are kind of limiting in their scope. I mean, you can't find a totality of your meaning in any of those kinds of things. And I think that people want something that's both historical and looking ahead to the future, but also something that has a positive aesthetic. And that's what Protestantism and modern Roman Catholicism have abandoned, have basically thrown out the baby with the bathwater, especially at Vatican II in Catholicism, was the Protestantization of their liturgy. And that's why you see guitar masses and clown masses and priests wearing Pink Floyd shirts and playing guitar and singing really lame praise and worship songs from evangelical. And you don't get any of that in Orthodoxy, because even the worst Orthodox church will still have a solid liturgy. So that's kind of the heart of Orthodoxy, is maintaining the worship of God. So I think that's why people are drawn, first of all, is just because of the maintenance of the aesthetic, and that it's ancient, it's foreign to the West, in the sense of, if you've never been to an Orthodox liturgy, then you've never seen anything like that. If you're a Western Christian, it'll kind of blow you away for the first time. And that's the root of the appeal, is like that documentary on the Icon discusses. We are an image dominated culture, and yet we seem to have this idea that God is somehow divorced from images. Because of the history of Protestantism, especially in America, and this is basically a Puritan founded country, Baptist founded country. So, the degenerate images will come to fill the place of beautifully, aesthetically pleasing images. And I think that iconography and images, the reason they have such a power is that they speak to us on multiple levels at once about the spiritual world. They speak to us beyond the here and the now. If I'm looking at a fashion magazine, I'm not looking at fashion magazines, but if somebody were flipping through fashion mags or Vogue or whatever, I just canceled my subscription to Vogue, by the way. I'm joking.
Oh, well, I can't say I've done the same, but
you have this idea of such a consumerist view of the image. I mean, you have all these images that are put into this magazine, and then it's thrown away and it's worthless, a week from now. And I think that very temporary nature of the image is contrasted with the iconographic conception of these images portraying an eternal reality, an eternal truth. Our images are not to be discarded, because even if obviously the icon can be destroyed, but the point is that the meaning, the truth that it conveys is eternal. The meaning, the truth conveyed in some skanky Lady Gaga pose in Vogue magazine is disgusting, and it's gone in a week. It means nothing. But our icons mean something, and that's why they have power. So that's why people are drawn, first and foremost, in America and the West, because of the aesthetic. Let's be honest. That aesthetic is not in any other churches. Now, there's all the other stuff, the theology as well, but most people don't come to Orthodoxy through the theology, generally speaking. I mean, they learn it, but they visit a church or they hear about it and they look and they see the beautiful chanting, they go see the icons, and it's the aesthetics.
That's a very, very appealing to a lot of the internet culture you see nowadays, sort of with the vaporwave aesthetics and stuff like that. That term actually had a revival, even though that term specifically actually has religious and spiritual context. But you see it all the time, like, aesthetic written with spaces and then Chinese characters or Japanese characters, right? So that's something I've noticed. I mean, I have a friend who runs a page called Orthowave, which is just Orthodox iconography in sort of that vaporwave style. So you're seeing this interesting combination of modern retroism with like even further retroism to the Orthodox Church, which is well, I guess you would agree with, and a lot of Orthodox, myself, we'll assume included for now, the original, the originator of before the Great Schism, as it were, the original church. And there's also this interesting thing, I think, that this term of aesthetic, it's very similar to the Romans' appeal to form. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying there.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, this is kind of fun. If you take aesthetics classes in college, if you study philosophy, you'll probably have to take some aesthetics classes, and you will study the Greek and the Roman conceptions of art. So yes, I'm familiar with both the Greek notion of mimesis and the Roman conception of form.
Exactly. And that's something that I think when you're talking about the aesthetic appeal of the Orthodoxy, it's mirroring of that. It's almost hearkening back to that in some way, of that classical. And then you're talking about this form of the sort of the degeneracy of icons. It's almost it's easily apparent to anyone who looks at a classical architecture and then looks at like New Age, Art Deco, any type of art, any new form art. It's actually apparent the phases that the speed of which that trend goes. It's almost forgettable, but yet classical architecture has this, I don't know, it has this staying power within the human consciousness that's actually very incredible.
Well, that's because of the philosophical, ideological shift in viewing the world. And yeah, I've talked about this on many shows and podcasts, is that you see a different architecture and aesthetic because of the idea of the loss of the eternal. So ancient medieval societies tended to believe in the beyond. They believed in the transcendent. They believed in metaphysics. They believed in the permanence of truth. They believed in the eternality of truth, back to Plato. So it makes sense that the art would reflect that. And so, for example, you have in Aquinas's aesthetic, he says that you need a certain level of, to have true beauty, it requires form, it requires proportion, it requires harmony. These different aspects are involved in anything that is, quote, good art. So actually, art is not relative. Art is objective. Good art actually is objective. That's not to say you can't have fun with it and that it's not loose at times, but just because something is a little bit loose doesn't mean you can't be objective with it and still say something is good or bad. And that's what was surprising to me when I did take art classes and look into the philosophy of beauty, was that this is really a modern notion. The idea that there's no objective beauty is part of the revolutionary tradition. And then you learn eventually that, oh, this has actually been done by design. So the Satanists of various flavors, even prior to like a LaVey type Satanism, it's been known back to the French Revolution that people who were more of that bent, they understood the conception of aesthetic terrorism, that you could terrorize people with hideous, disgusting art. And that's a real thing. And some modern versions of performance art are aesthetic terrorism. Lady Gaga does this stuff at times. You smear yourself in blood or something and stand in a public square for 6 hours. I mean, just these ridiculous things like this. It's a form of aesthetic terrorism to make a statement about what you think is being unique, but actually it's just, you're just playing unwittingly into the machinations of very degenerate social engineers. And then when you study social engineering, you realize, oh, actually, they know very well that these kinds of degenerate forms of art affect the culture, and you can debase the culture, and that's actually a form of psychological warfare, and that's 100% proven. You can read the Frankfurt School guys. Adorno talks about it. He talks about degrading people through art. You can read Francis Stoner Saunders' book, Cultural Cold War, which explains how the CIA basically co-opted the arts during the Cold War to promote all of this degeneracy in modern art as a, quote, freedom exercise. Oh, it's all freedom, you see. Vomiting on a canvas is freedom, and therefore that's how we beat the Soviets, right? Which is all retarded, but that's unfortunately what happened. And yeah, that's what I think is very appealing to a lot of people who don't know anything about Orthodoxy or even religion, is that you do have this maintenance of the tradition, of the notion of a specific conception of beauty, of form, of aesthetic, and that's the heart of the liturgy. And that makes sense with the way God set up the worship in the Old Testament. We believe that the Orthodox worship is essentially in continuity with the temple and the synagogue system that God set up. So even though we're not sacrificing animals, we believe that's fulfilled in Christ. And if you read about Solomon's temple, when God gave the instructions for that as a type or a foreshadowing of the coming temple, it was filled with iconography. It had a lot of gold and plating. It had a very large veil with angels and cherubim designed on the cover. It had palm trees and seraphim and cherubim. The ark was gold and had seraphim on top of the ark. And that's because it's supposed to signify Eden. And so basically when you walk into an Orthodox church, you're walking into something that is supposed to be both the temple and a kind of synagogue and Eden all at once. And that's the totality of our theology. It's not just encapsulated in iconography or in books, but actually in the very building, the artifice, the architecture itself.
That's interesting. Something that you just said that resonated with me, this whole concept of artistic terrorism is what you referred to it as?
Aesthetic terrorism is a satanic, it's more so from guys of the satanic persuasion. And this has actually been used in military operations. So, for example, Michael Aquino, the former LaVey guy who started the Temple of Set, he's a PsyOps guy, and he talks about aesthetic terrorism and using this in warfare. He's an Army colonel, by the way, so he's not a nobody. He's an Army specialist in psychological warfare. So, for example, doing this in the Phoenix program in Vietnam, where they would bring psychopaths to kill men, women, and children, and they kind of just let them loose. And you see this in movies like Apocalypse Now or Full Metal Jacket. And this was a way to terrorize the villagers.